Well, thanks, Ron. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you all. I'd like to go back a couple of years before 9/11 because really where this all starts and Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda go into the public knowledge, as it were the attacks on the embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi. And this was August 20th, 1998, when President Clinton said some things that I think really presaged what was going to happen after 9/11 and really for the following 20 years. And I want to quote him here because it really is prescient. He said that he wanted to strike at the network of radical groups that were affiliated and funded by bin Laden. And then he said that our forces targeted bases in Afghanistan, and they did as well in Sudan. And he said, our battle, and here I'm quoting now, our battle against terrorism didn't begin with the bombing of our embassies in Africa, nor will it end with today's strike, that is the strike on those two countries. It will require strength, courage, and endurance. We will meet it no matter how long it may take. This will be a long, ongoing struggle between freedom and fanaticism. And of course, that's what it turned out to be. Now, there weren't any additional attacks on bin Laden's bases in Afghanistan. We were planning, evidently, to do something. I wasn't in the administration then, obviously, but we didn't. And in fact, when Clinton spoke, he didn't even talk about the Taliban. He only spoke about Afghanistan per se. And by 1999 and into 2000, when Governor Bush, then Governor Bush, had a team of what he called the Vulcans, and we discussed national security issues, Afghanistan barely came up at all. Iraq hardly came up, but Afghanistan really didn't. And when Don Rumsfeld took over and I became comptroller, his focus was actually on inside the Pentagon issues by and large. For instance, he talked about transformation and what we then were calling skipping a generation, which was to modernize our forces. He wanted to incorporate best business practices. He wanted to find efficiencies in our overall base posture, and I'll come back to that because it affected me on 9/11. He wanted to focus on the growing threat from China. I think a lot of people have forgotten that, but he and I and a few others had been to China in 2000. And we'd been to the War Museum, and there was this big montage of a Chinese amphibious landing on Taiwan. And I think it affected all of us. He asked Andy Marshall, who was then head of net assessment, to look at what it took to deal with China. And Andy focused on naval forces, long-range strike, long-range air forces. Rumsfeld wanted to strengthen missile defenses. And he wanted to strengthen or really totally overhaul what he considered to be the bureaucratic inertia inside the department. And in fact, that was the subject of a speech he gave on the 10th of September, 2001. He constantly talked about the fact that he'd been away 25 years and nothing much had changed. Well, all that, of course, did change on 9/11 when the Pentagon and the Twin Towers were hit. He no longer was Secretary of Defense. He was Secretary of War. I was actually in Heidelberg at the time, together with a colleague, because the secretary had sent us out there to look at whether we could, in fact, close some overseas bases in Germany. I was hustled into an armored car. We then were put on a military aircraft, flew to Northolt in England, where a lot of the other senior officials who were around the world all married up, flew over New York City, saw the smoke coming up from the Twin Towers still, no aircraft in the sky except F-16s. And we meet at the Pentagon with the president at exactly 1800 on the 12th. And the president gave a kind of simile that I think made it clear to us we were going to war. He said that when a rancher down in Texas has some rattlesnakes, the neighbors ask that rancher to kill them. And if the rancher doesn't, the neighbors say, okay, we'll kill him for you. And it was pretty clear what he was talking about then. The military response was very, very rapid, but the financial response was even more quick because on September 14th, which was just 3 days after the bombings, Congress passed an emergency supplemental that was going to be in 2 tranches and would total $20 billion, and $10 billion was for immediate release in what was called the Defense Emergency Response Fund. That was a fund that had existed earlier. And what it did was it allowed you to move money around without worrying about the colors of money. The trouble was that there were other accounts that were set up by OMB that had nothing to do with the appropriations accounts. And OMB would not allow money to be moved from one of their accounts to another of their accounts without their okay. They also sat on a whole chunk of money for quite some time. So we had troops fighting in Afghanistan while OMB was still holding up the money for DOD. We really only got a couple of $100 million in the first few weeks. There wasn't any obvious post-war planning at the time. I guess others might speak about that. Maybe it was because the attack, the military response, and the congressional response happened so quickly. But what came to be called Reconstruction, maybe initially we thought the so-called international community would do that. After all, that we didn't take the lead on Reconstruction in Bosnia. We didn't have an American proconsul like we later had in Iraq. Again, there was an agreement in 2001 in Bonn that essentially put Hamid Karzai in charge, and then he was voted in by Aloya Jirga. But what we did do, and I think mistakenly so, in hindsight, obviously, was not so much to go into to suspect the Iraqis had a nuclear program, but to go in when we did before we finished the job in Afghanistan. Now, you know, bin Laden had already escaped Tora Bora. People can argue whether we could have gotten him or not gotten him, but the fact is that in 2002, 2003, and by that time, by the way, I had been named the DOD's coordinator for Afghanistan. You might want to ask, why is the comptroller the coordinator for Afghanistan? And the answer was because by that time, everybody was focusing on Iraq. They needed a senior person, at least at the undersecretary level, to deal with Afghanistan on a regular basis. And my counterpart in policy, Doug Feith, he was focused on Iraq. He and I got along pretty well. I didn't go behind his back on anything. So I wound up doing it. But that was an indication of where our priorities lay at the time. And it was unfortunate because in those early years, 2 million Afghans came back to Afghanistan. Small businesses started up. The Taliban was nowhere to be seen, even with a lot of escaping. Al Qaeda was on the run. We were in a position to stabilize the place. Now, should we have tried nation building? The irony is that President Bush was against nation building when he was governor and running for president. And 20 years later, President Biden is against nation building. President Obama was against nation building. We keep saying we're against it, but then we try to do it. And we don't do it terribly well. We rotate people in and out so they don't really understand the country. And I can give you one anecdote that I think encapsulates the problem. So I'm up in Mazar-e Sharif, and it's a Friday. And they want me to see a girls' school. Well, that's okay, except they had all the girls from the school there, and they had the teachers there. And this is the one day off for the teachers, and it's one day that the girls could play and not be in school. But instead, they were all forced because this undersecretary was coming. And so I meet with the headmaster of the school, who's wearing probably the only suit he has that he owns, and he invites me to lunch. And the civil affairs officer, who was a reserve captain, turns around and says to this guy, "Oh, the undersecretary can't have lunch with you. He has to see the facility." Now, if you know anything about Islam at all, you know that welcoming guests is one of the highest attributes that a good Muslim can have. And you should have seen that headmaster's face. it just dropped to the ground. So I turned around to the captain and said, Captain, you take some of my staff and they'll see the facility. I'm going to have lunch with the headmaster. And sure enough, the guy had laid out a phenomenal banquet. It was just an indication of how we simply do not fully understand cultures. And it has nothing to do with party. It has to do with how we Americans think of the world. We think everybody wants to be like us in every single way. They want to be like us in lots of ways, but not in every single way. So that was one lesson I really hope we learn. Many years later, I was on the commission that looked at contracting in Afghanistan and Iraq. And at that time, and this was, I think, the commission published its results in 2011, we had already estimated between 30 and 60 billion had been wasted in both countries, including a significant amount in Afghanistan. We looked away from that. The government simply was not signing contracts that tightly controlled what the contractors did. We were automatically renewing contracts. We weren't watching subcontracts carefully at all. And so what happened? Money got wasted, but even worse than that, we didn't force contractors to hand over to the Afghans the maintenance, the operation of the systems that they were being trained on. So that 20 years later, they still couldn't manage the aircraft. They still couldn't manage the complex systems without contractors. And so when contractors left, they didn't have anything that they could work with. Something else that I think is a lesson. We have to be very, very careful, not only about watching our contractors. They'll do whatever we tell them to do. This is not the contractor's fault. It's the government's fault. But not only that, we should make it clear that they have to hand over to whoever they're training by a certain date, or else it'll become what's called termination by default, and they'll have to pay termination liabilities. I think that's another major lesson that we could take away from that. There were a number of things that Rumsfeld did that he hasn't gotten enough credit for, and that became very, very important in the Afghanistan war. Against a lot of opposition, he pushed the whole idea of unmanned vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles. Of course, now we have lots of unmanned vehicles. He pushed that. It was obviously eventually the military had to accept it. He also increased the special forces, again, contrary to what a lot of the military wanted, who kind of looked at snake eaters as just that. But those two elements became critical to what Mr. Obama did and even what Mr. Trump did, and are likely to be critical in future. If we're not going to send large forces on the ground or in the air against terrorists, and the terrorists aren't going away, then those two elements of our military power become extremely important. So maybe I should stop there. I do want to say again that whatever happened in Afghanistan, there are lessons to be learned, positive lessons. And what may be even more important than just mouthing the lessons is actually absorbing them. We've said over and over again, we wouldn't fight a land war in Asia. I think it was MacArthur that was the first one that said it. We keep fighting land wars in Asia. It's not a matter of fighting the last war as much as absorbing what history tells us and applying it in a positive way to future contingencies that are certainly likely to face us, and that in most cases we will not have anticipated until they're upon us. Ron, that's what I've got, and back to you, sir.